Welcome and thank you for tuning in. In this video, I'll be talking about my paper called Financing Neighbor or Trade Credit Origins of Aggregate Fluctuations. Let me first give you the bigger picture and motivation for this paper. First, trade credit is a common contract on the delay of payments. For example, if I'm a firm and you are my customer, I can ship you the product, but I can also include payment terms that allow you, as my customer, to pay your bill within 30 days, quarter of a year, or even longer. So effectively, me as a firm, I'm lending in kind when extending trade credit to my customers. Second, trade credit has been widely used by all types of firms, so both the very small ones, but also the very large ones. And if you look further into the data, then there are only a few firms who really extend more trade credit than their own financial needs to finance their cost of production and therefore act as true financial intermediaries in the economy. Third, there's been a lot of anecdotal and empirical evidence that trade credit actually has two counteracting features. On the one hand, firms smooth out financial shocks by substituting bank and trade credit. On the other hand, trade credit can also affect financial conditions of downstream customers and thereby amplify financial shocks. For example, if I'm again the firm and I face this increase in my cost of bank credit, I, for instance, could go to my supplier and demand more trade credit, thereby smoothing out that financial shock. On the other hand, I can also go to my customer and demand immediate payments of their bills, and thereby not extending any trade credit to downstream customers anymore. In this setup, what happened, for instance, during the financial crisis, it has been documented and shown that trade credit actually was severely affected at the onset of the 2008-2009 financial crisis and actually caused a lot of liquidity problems along the supply chain. Against this backdrop, in my paper, I'm going to ask three questions. First, do trade credit linkages now amplify or dampen the propagation of financial shocks? Second, how did trade credit linkages now contribute to the drop in output during the 2008-2009 financial crisis? And third, what determines the importance of a firm or producer for the propagation of financial shocks in a supply chain where we have both trade and financial linkages present? In order to answer these questions, I'm going to first build a multi-sector model with endogenous trade credit linkages, and then I'm going to take the model to the data, particularly the US economy, to provide quantitative answers to the three questions I just posed for you now. Let me now introduce you briefly into the model of my paper and the model setup that includes endogenous trade credit linkages. So first, along the supply chains, firms face working capital constraints, so they have to finance their inputs before they receive any revenues. Firms can finance their working capital by choosing between bank and trade credit, and at the same time, firms also choose how much trade credit to supply to their customers. In this setup, let me now elaborate more on the trade-offs that firms face when it comes to their credit composition choice and the choice of supplying trade credit to customers. So first, consider the credit composition. So clearly here, firms face a trade-off between both the cost of bank credit and the cost of trade credit. But at the same time, I assume that firms cannot one-for-one substitute between either credit source, and this pins down the credit composition to finance the working capital constraints. Second, when firms choose how much trade credit to supply to the customers, in my model they choose what fraction of the revenues they extend on trade credit to customers, and that pins down the interest rate on trade credit. In that problem, firms face a trade-off between the additional revenue they can generate when acting as financial intermediaries, coming from the interest rate payments by their customers, and at the same time, the increase in the cost of bank credit that they face when extending more trade credit to customers. The latter comes from the assumption in my paper that a bank would charge a firm with a higher share of the revenues outstanding on trade credit also a higher interest rate on bank loans, as it would perceive that firm as riskier. In equilibrium, these credit costs and in my model would also distort the optimal input demand and prices, and at the aggregate level would also map into aggregate efficiency and labor wedges, similar to any model that features distortions as has been shown in previous work. So this is nothing new. What is new in my model is that setup that I introduced also introduces endogenous trade credit costs and endogenous trade credit composition, in which context these distortions are now endogenous and interdependent. And by that, we're having a credit multiplier present that's going to have an effect on the way financial shocks can propagate in my economy. Let me now elaborate on the trade credit mechanism that is new to this paper. So for this purpose, to illustrate the mechanism, let us consider a very simple supply chain. So we have supplier S, so I'm going to use sector and firm interchangeably. We have supplier S, firm K, and K's customer C, and I assume here that C is only supplying to the final household, but it's not extending any credit to households in this case. So for our purpose, to illustrate the mechanism, consider now a financial shock to the middle firm, so firm K, who faces an increase in the bank risk premium and has an increase in their cost of production therefore. How does now this shock propagate to both supplier and customer? For the supplier, well, first, this increase in the cost of production of sector K will lead to a decrease in the demand for its supplier's output. However, at the same time, firm K is going to substitute away from bank loans and demand more trade credit from its supplier. By increasing trade credit now, firms K can smooth out that cost shock, which dampens a little bit the output response of supplier S. So this is our smoothing effect. Downstream, this increase in the cost of production via this increase in bank loans will lead to an increase in the price that sector K or firm K is charging its customers, but also it's going to increase the interest rate that is charging on trade credit. And in that way, customer C faces two cost shocks, one coming from the price of inputs and the other one coming from the price, the interest rate, the increase in the interest rate that it has to pay now for trade credit. So by that, we have this amplification going on downstream if we also introduce credit linkages. You might now ask, what determines now the importance between the smoothing and amplification effect? Well, as I show in my paper, it turns out that this net lending position, or defined as the ratio of accounts receivable to bank loans, which in the context of the model is equal to total cost of production minus accounts payable, that will determine the relative strength of this smoothing and amplifying features. In our simple example, we can see that supplier S would be a so-called net lender. So this firm can only extend trade credit, but does not have another supplier who we can demand trade credit from. So a shock to such a net lender will imply that the amplification effect will be more pronounced in the propagation of this financial shock. At the same time, if we have a shock to a net borrower here, so sector C or customer C will only obtain trade credit from sector K, but it's not extending any credit to households. So a shock to such a net borrower will imply that the smoothing effect will be more pronounced when it comes to the propagation of shocks. All right, having said that, in the second part of the paper, I'm taking the model to the data and calibrate that to the US economy for the period 1997 till 2016. And with that calibration, I'm going to provide quantitative answers to the questions I posed at the beginning of the presentation. So do trade credit linkages now amplify or dampen the propagation of financial shocks? First, from the model introduced endogenous trade credit linkages and smoothing and amplifying features. Simulating the model, the simulation results suggest that the trade credit channel actually reduced aggregate volatility by 1.4%, which was not a lot over that time period, but was indicative that there was some smoothing going on, but wiped out a lot by the amplification happening at the same time. Second, how did trade credit linkages now contribute to the drop in output during the 2008-2009 financial crisis? First, the model, with financial shocks only, captures about a third of the decline in output in that crisis. Comparing the module simulations to a counterfactual case with bank credit only, I can then infer that 16% of the drop in output during the crisis are then attributed to the existence of that credit linkages only. And last but not least, I also asked the question, what determines the importance of a producer for the propagation of financial shocks? As I've argued theoretically and now also quantitatively, it turns out that it's going to be this net lending position, so the ratio of accounts receivable, how much trade credit a firm extends to its customers relative to its own financial needs to finance its production, so cost of production minus accounts payable. So this novel measure essentially is a good indicator for how systemically important a firm will be when it comes to trade credit to propagating also financial shocks. This was it. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and please do also check out the other videos in this session. Thank you.